to you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, everyone. Again, Amy McNamara. So I wanted to just say something I think all of you will find hopefully funny, if nothing else, before I pass it over to Jonathan. So 2 things I've learned from my 16-year-old son who's here doing homeschooling. I said, Mom, you talk too loud, you talk for too long. So I'm going to try to not do other those things. And then my dog also has told me that she's tired of walking 2-3 times a day. So I suspect from some of the things I've seen on Instagram and Facebook, we're all sort of going through the same trials and tribulations. We're going to switch things up a little bit today from what we had originally planned. Jonathan Hughes has limited time this morning, so I'm going to kick it off to him. He's a property manager with Colliers International, and he offers a great perspective to what we're experiencing through this COVID-19. Jonathan?
Thanks, Amy. And if we're not the fittest country or state in the world after this is all done, I would be very much surprised, as much walking as goes on. Excuse me, just a bit of, good morning, everybody. Just a bit of perspective. I'm the managing director for Colliers Real Estate Management Services, otherwise known as REMS, R-E-M-S. And we do manage about 4.6 million square feet of property here in San Diego County, all parts of San Diego County from north to south and west to east and everywhere in between. So it's being one of the biggest counties around, obviously it's a big job. Of that portfolio, we've got 30 total buildings, 271 tenants, and about 26 different clients who also range from institutional clients to mom and pops and have very different perspectives, but more importantly, very different liquidity levels and how much they can afford to handle these kinds of challenges. The vast majority of our portfolio is in fact retail. We inherited a portfolio of retail properties a couple of years ago now. So we're at 52%, which is rather unusual for Colliers. Colliers normally is an industrial manager of property with about 60% of most market portfolios. To the particular topic at hand, as far as inquiries for rent abatement and rent deferrals, we've probably had a good 50 to 60% of our tenants that have asked. I don't know of one that has actually received any deferral. And part of that reason is, we're only in the first month of this episode. If it goes into May, it might be a completely different story. April, pretty much everybody paid their rent, but we have had a lot of inquiries. As I understand, only one of our tenants actually went to the point of a lease amendment that gave them an abatement. And again, I speak to an abatement versus a deferral or a forgiveness. Many of our clients are looking to help, obviously, but they do not wish to give away free rent. They're putting up a lot of obstacles. They're asking for tenants to go through a lot of hoops, primarily looking at their own fundamental financial capabilities, obviously looking at financial statements and whatnot. But the landlords that we work for don't necessarily want to be the lender of last resort, for lack of a better phrase. They are looking for tenants to exhaust every other opportunity that's available to them, whether it's the PPP. Again, we did have one client who managed to get themselves funded through the PPP and decided, at first I didn't realize this, but they said, well, we'll pay all of our rent. And then I realized they had to pay it because that was part of the terms. But either way, that landlord is being made whole. I can tell you that our workload as a property management group has increased by 30 to 50%. We haven't fortunately lost anybody yet. I don't know if that will remain the case if this continues on. And it's my understanding that state by state basis, who knows how long California will continue on in this regard. I know some other states are getting back to work already. I've worked on my playoff beard, so when we go back to work, I have to shave this off at that point. The big box retailers that we have in many of our retail centers, the Dick's Sporting Goods, the Best Buy, the Bed Bath & Beyond, most of them either out and out stopped paying rent, didn't pay rent for this month. We haven't found out whether they're going to pay rent for May yet. I would anticipate they don't. They have that wherewithal and power to do so. As you know, the eviction processes have been put on hold for the most part. So there are very few levers for a landlord to go back after these monies right off the bat. Many of our smaller operators are closed for the duration. And the general consensus, I would argue, is, and again, this is anecdotal, I would argue that most of our clients feel that a lot of these requests are tactical, for lack of a better word. We've had several requests from folks who are not doing very well from a business standpoint, and I think they are looking to change their financial position with the lease in particular. But as a tenant, from a property management standpoint, you have to ask. If my understanding is that most of the listeners on this call are tenants, and if that's the case, then you got to ask. You got to at least put the request into the landlord so that he's aware of your issues and decide one way or another whether he wants to help you out or not. Again, it goes back to the question of abatement or deferral or forgiveness. Most landlords are going to look for rent abatement or deferral, if anything, and they're going to want that money back. And typically they're doing it through amortizing into the remainder of the term. That's what we've done on a couple of other folks, that, or at least the one other that did get it. Our other biggest issue is staffing, maintaining engagement, keeping people engaged and interested is difficult at best, but we have an awful lot of work to do. So by default, they have to remain engaged. And our biggest anticipatory issue is what the world is going to be like. And I'm sure it's the same for the brokers on their side as well. What the use of real estate is going to be like after this episode continues. Property managers are paid based on a percentage of revenue. And if revenues change dramatically for our clients, our pricing model is probably going to have to change as well. That's above my pay grade. That's for smarter people than me to figure out. And hopefully they'll do so. As a matter of fact, someone mentioned earlier that I do have to leave early because we have, and this is good news, I think, we have a company-wide call on reentry planning. So hopefully that is good news, and we're going to start getting back to some semblance of the old norm, much less a new normal. Is there anything else I can add to that for you?
No, thank you, Jonathan. We appreciate your time. I know that you have to go. I think there might be some questions for you that we can forward to you after this is
Sure.
over.
Yeah, no problem. I'd be happy to entertain them.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. So I wanted to offer a little bit of a broader stroke to all of this that's happening right now. Similar to everyone else, probably here in this room and in the country, you know, our offices are also closed. We decided to refocus our efforts in helping landlords and tenants navigate through, you know, really what are unprecedented times. Every situation and every solution, I think, is different. I was a broker during the last Great Recession, and one of the biggest things I learned, and I believe it to be still true today, is landlords do not want to lose their tenants, and banks do not want to manage or be owners of commercial real estate. I think that's important to note. I also think that that it's important that as tenants, you know, we stay as transparent as possible when talking to our landlords. Brendan mentioned to me yesterday that one thing that, you know, is not going to go over well with him or any other landlord is if a tenant just stops paying rent and, you know, does not communicate with the landlord. I think what people sometimes forget is that landlord have their own unique set of circumstances, loans to pay, property taxes, insurance, etc. But I would also caution landlords to understand that a hard line approach doesn't benefit anybody. I'd also tell landlords that they should understand who their tenants are, what their business is, and how they are affected in these times. I think all those things are very important. I would also tell tenants to make sure that they've read thoroughly through their leases. They understand their obligation in that lease, more specifically to their insurance clauses in their lease, as well as looking at their insurance policies. And we can get into some more of that later if people have questions more specific to that. I also think tenants should have year-to-date financials ready at this time for a variety of reasons, but more specifically to provide to your landlord in the event you'll be asking for some sort of accommodation. Let's think what else here I've got for you. I think that it's just really important that we're all sort of navigating this together, and this is something that really hadn't been experienced in the past. I don't think it's going to be like the Great Recession, because I think we've learned a lot of things previous, and I don't think anyone wants to go back to that situation or circumstance. With all that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Joe. Joe is also with the urban property team, and he's going to offer some insight onto some of the valuable resources out there, as well as some of the plans that are being worked out with the existing landlords.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. And thanks everyone for joining this call, or Zoom, I should say. I'll expand on a couple of things that Jonathan Hughes spoke about. It's great having his perspective because he deals with a lot of institutional clients, but I think it's important to note, as in North County, we have a lot of landlords that are private equity, a lot of smaller tenants, and there's a whole spectrum of tools to use where both parties can get through this crisis and hopefully a win-win situation. I'll kind of list a couple of them, but one thing I think is important to note for both parties, landlords and tenants, as we go through this, is that once this is done, you're still going to have a relationship with your landlord. And so I think it's important to think about, 6 months from now or end of the year, where we stand, how is that relationship going to look? And to Amy's point, and Jonathan as well, when tenants just don't communicate and maybe just stop paying rent and there's no communication, then, it might set a bad precedent. So I think to Amy's point, communication between both parties during this time is the best thing that everyone can do, as well as being open and transparent with the hardship. I mean, it's a hardship that everyone understands, and it's very tangible. Businesses are closed. It's very tangible hardship. So I'll go through just a couple examples of things I've seen that clients have worked out with tenants. And again, it's a broad spectrum, and it all depends on the landlord situation, the tenant situation. And I'm sure Brendan will touch more on, some landlord obligations and some challenges that landlords have, many challenges that landlords have as well. But we've seen some instances where tenants will pay, work out a deal with the landlord and say, hey, I'm going to pay the CAMs and the triple nets for 1 to 3 months, and then re-amortize, as Jonathan said, the balance over an extended period of time, maybe over the next year, 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, whatever kind of works for the parties. We've seen some tenants work out a deal where they pay some rent and re-amortize that over the future. We've seen some just keep paying rent, the majority actually, especially for April. May be an interesting conversation as we approach May 1st. Other people have looked at adding term to a lease and extending that out, or tweaking things where they extend for a year in exchange for some help or relief during this time. And lastly, what all landlords are doing that I've seen is they're making sure that tenants know the resources available to them, such as the PPP through the CARES Act. Now there's also the PUA unemployment for businesses and self-employed individuals, which is actually available starting right now, today, which people can go apply for. So all landlords are looking for tenants to exhaust all the resources that they can and have the landlord be kind of the step, as far as solving the issue. I'll touch on PPP real quick. It's, as everyone knows, there's a ton of news articles about it and what's going on. The first round was challenging for, I think, especially small businesses. It seems like the majority of small businesses were left out, mainly because of the logistics of getting it through. We've had some clients that have received funds, which is great, but we've also had a lot that are saying, hey, I'm dead in the water here. I can't get any PPP. We're hoping that this next round might be a little bit easier. Just so everyone knows, the federal government, or the SBA, now allows non-FDIC insured banks to issue PPP loans. So we're hoping that that'll kind of open it up a little bit more. That means credit unions, even PayPal and Intuit, they're approved now through the SBA. I haven't seen their portals open yet, but there should be other lines of inquiry regarding PPP, which should hopefully give access to smaller companies, which was a challenge in the first place, especially if you're a smaller company and you have a banking relationship with, say, a Wells Fargo or a Chase. You're in line with millions of people to get it. So I'd recommend, and we actually have a link that we found a good website that lists them all out, which we can send out to everybody. But if that's an avenue that people want to take, I highly recommend exploring all different options there, because it is a very challenging process now with everybody, getting in line for their program. That's kind of my down and dirty of what we're seeing going on with different clients. Very interested to hear Brendan's insight as a landlord who manages quite a few properties, quite a bit of retail as well. And what they're doing, and I'm sure he'll be able to talk to kind of the tenant landlord relationship from that perspective to get some good insight.
And just a reminder that if you have questions for any of our speakers, go ahead and put them in chat, and we'll be reading them out in the order that they come in and trying to summarize them. So again, put them in chat if you're interested. Great.
Thank you. One thing I wanted to mention is, before I turn it over to Brendan, the reason we chose Brendan to be part of this webinar is he's going to have a really unique perspective. And what I mean by that is, not only is Brendan an owner of commercial property, he is also a tenant of various commercial properties throughout San Diego County. So he's got a dual perspective. And Brendan, I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Thanks, everybody, for hopping on today. Again, my name is Brendan, kind of the managing director of a small investment company, real estate investment company called Fabric. We're based in Carlsbad Village and have a concentration of our investments in North County, and then some in the urban markets as well. Been doing that since 2012, primarily focused on retail and office. And then also co-owner of Block Co-working, which you may be familiar with. We have 3 locations, all in North County, Solana Beach, Carlsbad, and Leucadia. And as Amy mentioned, from the Block perspective, we are actually a tenant in 2 of our 3 buildings. So it has been an interesting approach, kind of wearing the landlord hat and the tenant hat through these challenging times and having these challenging discussions. But I think it's given me more insight as to, how I want to be treated as a tenant, and then therefore how I want to be treating my tenants on the other side of that. I think, the common thread that's been mentioned, which I think ultimately from a landlord's perspective is the most important, is communication. I kind of have outlined, at least in my opinion, kind of the 6 steps or 6 tips to effective communication with your landlord if you are looking for some assistance. So I'll kind of just touch on those really quick and then make a few other points. Number 1, start early. If rent's due on May 1st, don't wait till the 30th to throw out a request, or even after rent due date. Start early as you can in communicating with your landlord. Number 2, have a clear ask. As a landlord myself, And we also manage all of our own properties. We have about 35 tenants, and I'd say about 40 or 50% did make requests for something for April. And then on Block, the co-working side, which, you know, is kind of like a bunch of micro tenants, we have about 250 members. So we also are fielding a lot of inquiries there as well. So have a clear ask. And if you're not sure what your ask is supposed to be, maybe talk to people that you trust that are in the industry, or like people like Amy that can be an advisor to you to help kind of formulate what your ask is going to be. Just keep in mind that your landlord may be fielding a bunch of different inquiries and a bunch of different asks. So if you're very vague and not clear, you know, then you're essentially putting more work onto them to try to make quick responses and quick decisions. So I think the clearer your ask can be, the better. Number 3, don't neglect mentioning the kind of the highlights of your resume as a tenant. If you've been a strong tenant, if you've continually paid on time, you know, if you have a long-standing relationship with the landlord, if you've invested significant money into your property, these are all things worth mentioning as you kind of build a case for some assistance. Number 4, mention some of the alternative solutions that you're looking at or pursuing other than just addressing your lease. Have you applied for the PPP? Have you applied for an EIDL loan, the disaster relief? Are you doing capital calls with any investors you might have? Are you looking to refi any of your other debts? Are you willing to come out of pocket to cover some of your overhead? Number 5, discuss the actual impact that COVID-19's had on your business. And as Amy mentioned, it might be wise to have some profit and loss statements or different things like that. I mean, some of it may be obvious if you're a retail business that's been completely shut down. But, you know, don't neglect pointing out like what the hardships actually are in tangible ways that your landlord can understand. And number 6, don't neglect discussing your plans to rebuild or rebound or reopen or retool. I think from a landlord's perspective, you know, I want my tenant to not just be playing defense all the time and trying to think of a way out. You know, like, how are you going to be innovating your company? How do you see yourself succeeding over the next 6 to 12 months once this, you know, subsides? And I think, you know, this goes for landlords and tenants alike. There's got to be a refocus on balance sheets. I think so many companies in this day and age and in this long run that we've had in the economy has been so focused on growth that this unfortunately is going to be a tough lesson learned for a lot of companies, that you really maybe didn't pay enough attention to your balance sheet along the way, you know, to build that kind of war chest for a rainy day. So, you know, also be thinking about that. And I think just overall, your communication with your landlord, think about how you're posturing it. You know, is it a phone call? Is it an email? What's that relationship? How many other tenants does your landlord have or your property management company are working with? How many other inquiries are they going to be fielding? How can you stand out amongst those and really put yourself in the best position to get a favorable response? I read an interesting study that got put out by Pegasus. It was related to landlord approach with more mom and pop tenants, which I'm guessing the majority of the participants on this call, you know, would be considered more of a mom and pop business owner. And it was interesting. This was related to April, and about 700 landlords were polled, and 11% there was no concessions granted, meaning they did nothing for their tenants. 62% granted deferrals, where, you know, they gave some portion of the rent, you know, off, and it would be paid back at a later time. 8% provided some actual rent abatement or free rent forgiveness with no payback. And then 20% did some other solution, which could have included, you get some free rent with an extension of the lease, 50% of your security deposit and 50% payment, half deferred, half collected on time, different things like that, which I thought was just an interesting kind of rounded review of how people are approaching it. I think obviously we've seen deferral as the big strategy to kind of soften the blow, which is a strategy that I've taken with a lot of our tenants. One thing from a tenant's perspective to be careful of. You know, if you are able to get your landlord to defer some or all of your rent, that's great. But if you're already paying a market rent and you're now deferring current rent over whatever period of time, you may be reopening with an exceedingly high rent. And, you know, although we may be out of it and you may be generating revenue, you know, stop and think about what do the next 6 to 12 months look like, and are you going to be able to reopen your doors with this added rent burden? You know, even though you might be saving some now, that deferral could end up coming back to hurt you later. And I think of that from a landlord perspective is, you know, if some of my tenants, if their rent is already, you know, maybe they're in a higher market area like Solana Beach or Del Mar or something like that, you know, are they going to be able to afford this even increased rent once it's deferred? Yes, it may help them now, but, you know, try to spread that out over as long as you can, I would say. So those are just some tips. I think from our perspective, we are a long-term hold landlord, and our investors have a long-term hold mentality. So I think that positions us a little differently to pursue alignment with our tenants and potentially grant more deferrals or rent abatements than others, which is, you know, neither here nor there. I think everyone has a unique perspective and unique position on this. We've been, I think, pretty open to working with our tenants to try to find common ground. I think paying no rent as a tenant is sort of a challenging position to put your landlord in, because it feels like, you know, 100% of the downside of that particular business relationship is falling on one party, which I don't believe should happen. So I think it's more about finding a way that, you know, that people can share in the downside, and ultimately it's driven by communication. Some things to keep in mind from a landlord's perspective is landlords, oftentimes, especially in North County, are small businesses just like tenants. You know, our company has 4 employees. We have some overhead. We have the same kind of business economic issues that the rest of a lot of these businesses and our tenants have as well. So keeping in mind that your landlord is not, you know, potentially some multi-millionaire, billionaire who, you know, a lot of us are just kind of like in the trenches with everybody else. You know, we have significant expenses on a monthly basis, which include debt service, property taxes, insurance, repairs and maintenance, management. These are all expenses that could be considered vital and not able to abandon. So those are things that you need to keep in mind, is that your landlord has certain expenses that they can't avoid. And then oftentimes from the landlord's perspective, you know, we're not getting a ton of wiggle room from banks, from our lenders right now. If anything, potentially some deferral, which ultimately means the same thing I mentioned before, is we're going to have a heightened payment later on. But these deferrals aren't being spread out over 12 months. They're usually, you got to true up by the end of the year or even a shorter period of time. So, you know, it's keeping in mind that your landlord is also running a business in many cases, and maybe their liquidity is not as big as some institutional landlord. So kind of working with them through the communication channel to figure out what they can do as well, I think is important. Overall, yeah, I can't emphasize enough, you know, for us, the most effective outcomes, I think, for our tenants who are asking for help have been because they communicated really well. We're making quick decisions. We're filtering a lot of information. We're playing a lot of defense. So the way that you can stand out is by really articulating your message.
Brendan, thank you very much for that. And again, we had a couple of questions. I know that a couple people answered them in chat, but I'll see if anybody wants to take a stab at them. One was a question about the moratoriums right now, and the fact that we've got eviction moratoriums from either the perspective of the landlord or from the real estate perspective. How is that, or is that yet coloring the conversations between the landlord and tenants as you're seeing it move forward. I know we've in North County, I think every city's passed an ordinance. And then again, the courts are essentially closed. So even then beginning a proceeding would be difficult at best right now. So let me see, maybe start with Amy, Joe, and then Brendan. And of course you can pass on answering that question, but maybe take that in order. Amy?
Yes, thank you. So I think at a minimum,
Oops.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
Sorry, my fault.
It's okay. So I think what's important to note here is that a moratorium for eviction is not mean not that that people cannot pay rent. So usually in a lot of these workouts, that rent just gets extended, either on closer to the front end of that term or the back end of that term. I think there's still a lot of information that's going to come out of all of this that we've yet to hear. Joe and Brendan, do you want to add to that?
I'll add a quick note. I'm sure Brendan has a comment on it. I just think a tenant going in to discuss with the landlord with that kind of backdrop can be misleading. Basically, what this is doing is just dragging everything out. It's going to bring any conflict to a head at a later date. So to Brendan's point about talking to your landlord and coming up with a plan and being very open is very important. What I've seen some tenants do is not talk to their landlord, go, oh, there's this eviction ban, I'm just not going to pay rent. And 2 months from now, they're going to be in a way worse position than anyone else that's discussing and coming up with a plan with their landlord. So I think it's kind of dangerous that that's out there, to be honest, because it is kicking the can down the road from people that may want to abuse it.
Yeah, I would agree. That doesn't come into my conversations at all because it's not a route that I want to pursue with anyone. Like Amy said, I think, keeping your tenants right now is super important. I also think it shouldn't be a driving point for a tenant. Yeah, the latest that we know is for countywide in San Diego, there's a moratorium on evictions as of March 24th, which basically means, during this emergency time, landlords cannot evict residential or commercial tenants, and they cannot charge late fees on unpaid rent. However, in most cases, it allots for, and this needs some clarity once things settle down or once we start to reopen, basically says like, you're going to have 3 months after the emergency period ends, which I'm guessing is in line with the stay-at-home order ending or being somewhat lifted. You're going to have 3 months to true up. Like if your landlord didn't grant you any deferral or abatement during that period, and you elected not to pay your rent, you're going to have 3 months to pay all that rent back in addition to any rent you owe during those months. So essentially you could be digging a hole that you're going to need to address here in the next 4 or 5 months, as opposed to working out a solution with your landlord that maybe spreads that rent over a 12-month period or a 2-year period. So I think, having that as your kind of tool or your strategy is probably not in your best interest, because, it also drives a landlord, I think, further away if you're kind of waving that flag, further away from wanting to do any kind of compromise. Most of them know the rules and they know that there's going to be a true up period here pretty soon. So.
Perfect. Thank you very much, all three of you. We also had one question and see if you guys want to take a stab on it. For anybody that's working out right now, deferrals or a deferral with an extension, are you contemplating adding an escalator to it and thus assuming that you're going to have continued rent increases, or are you doing a rent freeze in respect to how things are moving forward as the lease continues to play itself out?
Well, I'll take it really quickly. I mean, my recommendation would be to not increase those rents. And that would be my dialogue with the landlord moving forward. Brendan may have a different perspective on that. I'm not sure. Brendan?
I mean, I think it's a case by case, right? It has to do with maybe, are you deferring 100% of the rent versus 50% of the rent? Are you coming up on any escalations in your existing term? It's really hard to, I think, put a blanket solution or answer to that question, just because I do think it's case by case. But I would caution tenants, be a little bit weary, or at least give extra thought to, what is the cost of the deferral, right? Or the abatement, right? Are they tacking on some type of increase or interest on that deferred rent, and what is that going to cost you later? I think it's hard to have a long-term vision in this short-term dilemma, but if you can, I think that's important, because ultimately we all want to get back to business. And now if you're burdened by this, added cost, is that going to be worth it? I mean, ultimately, if you can't pay your rent right now, you may have no other choice.
And I just want to add one more comment to all this. I mean, the goal here, as I see it, is for us to all end up with good working relationships between both the landlord and the tenant. So, that's the dialogue that I know both Joe and I have with the people we're talking to is, I think we all need to see this from a human perspective and, how we would want to be dealt with.
We have kind of a question about kind of doing some forecasting. And in terms of sort of current market activity that you might have seen for April, what there was, are you seeing a significant softening in prices and demand, or where's sort of the, as on the new leasing side, where's sort of the market currently stand?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a difficult question to ask. I think it's still yet to be seen. I mean, we are still seeing some activity. There are, still businesses that have to, grow and expand. We also are seeing a lot of people just kind of holding tight right now to see what the future holds. I think in times like this, there's always going to be an expectation that there should be some lowering of rents and sale prices, but I think it's too early to tell. I'm hoping, I don't know if I wanted to let everyone know today at noon, Governor Newsom is having a discussion on the roadmap to get us reopened. The sooner we do that, I think the sooner we can get back to normal business as normal. Joe, Brendan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with Amy. I think it's just too early to tell. I know a lot of people, especially buyers who are out looking for deals, those deals really aren't there. I mean, the next 3-4 months, I mean, who knows? I don't think anyone really knows just yet. But there had been such a demand for, good retail locations before this occurred. I think it's just too early to really say.
This is a question, is an interesting one that sort of speaks to whether something that either NAIOP or BOMA may have done, and I don't know that, but this question asks that the California Restaurant Association has a Corona rent payment delay and repayment agreement, a sample agreement that's available for tenants. Has anybody seen anything that's on a more generic level for general office or commercial that's out there that people can use, or that's a resource that people don't have to recreate the wheel?
I know that
yeah.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, the AR forms, which are the most common forms used for commercial tenants, they have basically the exact same template form, which says how much they're paying. Here's a payment plan or whatever you kind of work out. And if anyone needs help with any of that stuff, we're happy to be of assistance.
Excellent. All right. If anybody has any more questions, we'll do it in chat. So we'll give people just a little bit. I think, I think that the message here was a really good one, which is North County is, especially on our commercial and industrial space to also a certain extent, is principally comprised of small businesses on both sides of the equation. So trying to make something that works together, that creates a win-win, can only make sense to keep our regions stronger and come out of this in a better position than if what we spend the rest of 2020 and 2021 doing is sort of litigating and going through the crisis on that. Again, I would mention to anybody on the call, and especially to forward on to tenants, to clients, though we're getting close to being filled up. On Thursday at 10 o'clock, again, we have another webinar. This one about the P3 program, but not about how to apply in banks and everything else, but it's really talking about those that either have been funded or are close to getting funded, and how to set up proper procedures and create a workable audit trail without too much labor, so that you get that loan forgiven as a grant and it's not converted into something that you have to pay SBA back. That should be an interesting session. Paul Polito over at Polito and Epich did a great job in putting something together. So we're really looking forward to that presentation. Anything? Yeah, to close, our speakers want to add anything else? Amy?
Well, just one thing I wanted to mention to everybody here, the PUA opened today, the Pandemic Unemployment Act. So if you're an independent contractor, that's open for you to apply for unemployment benefits.
Great, thanks for that, Amy. Brendan?
You know, I think to have kind of an optimistic closing from my point of view, I think North County, San Diego is going to do really well coming out of this, you know, relatively speaking. I think me personally, if anything, this situation and this kind of like stay at home has really emphasized like the importance of community and the importance of neighborhood. I think, you know, if I was a mall owner, I'd be pretty concerned. I think there's going to be just a general desire once we start this gradual reopening for people to flock to their local businesses, their local coffee shops. I think people have this, you know, you look out your home right now and all your neighbors are out walking around, and it's just, I don't know, it has this like new sense of neighborhood. At least I'm seeing that. And I think that's what kind of keeps me optimistic, especially for a lot of my small business tenants on the retail front, is I do believe that, you know, this like shop small, shop local mentality is going to really heighten coming out of this. And I think it will be even ongoing beyond that, where I think a lot of maybe the bigger box kind of corporate stores might suffer quite a bit from this, you know, just the crowdedness and the you know, the commuting to it. I think I'm really bullish on North County coastal towns doing well. And I think small business owners, brick and mortar, mom and pop retailers doing well after this. So I'm hoping that, you know, as hard as this has been to kind of sift through and see the light at the end of the tunnel, like to me and a lot of my tenants that I'm talking to and others, that is a positive like viewpoint that I think is resonating with a lot of people. And I think everybody's going to be excited to get back out there and support their local retail that they, you know, that they miss or that they came accustomed to going to. And there'll be a new sense of like importance to that.
That's great. Joe, anything that you'd like to add here to close us off?
Well, I just want to thank everyone again. This was very beneficial, I think, for myself and for everyone to hear some different perspectives. And I really appreciate what Brendan's been saying. It's nice, you know, going through this to see people that, you know, you've been in heavy negotiations with in the past have a very soft side in dealing with their tenants and tenants with landlords. So throughout all of this, I think the humanness of everyone is kind of coming out, and it's really cool to see. And to Brendan's point, I think we're going to have a very strong North County community, stronger as a result of all this. So I'm looking forward to everybody being open and visiting everyone's shop.
Well, thank you. I couldn't have said that better. And again, I just want to thank the Colliers team and Brendan as well for pulling this together and agreeing to do this. You know, I've always said when I took this job a couple years ago, I really did say that the commercial real estate industry and of course the tenants that fill those buildings are the tip of the spear of sub-regional economic development. You guys bring people in and create opportunities both for providing them space, and then the businesses that grow and thrive in them create some more vibrant North County. And so again, I really want to thank you for participating. If anybody has any remaining questions, you can put them in chat for a little bit longer and we'll get them out. Again, the recording will be up on our website, so should you have missed some of the beginning parts, you can rewatch an exciting YouTube. And again, thank you everybody for participating and doing that. Amy, do you want to take us out and say any last comments here?
Yeah, no, I agree with both Brendan and Joe. I feel really good about, you know, how people are acting and reacting towards each other. I think it's given me a renewed sense of how I do business and the area that I do business in.
Great. Well, thank you all. And again, thanks for joining us today for this webinar on commercial real estate in COVID in North County. Thank you very much.